In this video, I want to go back to the fundamental beginning of this theory, all the way back to the fundamental axioms that build the theory. I think for me, when I go back to the beginning, what I see is there's really only two things that we know exist. One of them is the awareness behind the understanding of being here, being alive, existing, right? Outside of that, there is a 3D world. There's a something, right? All of that something could be manipulated by the awareness, right? But there has to be something there to be manipulated. So something is there. We know that there is something that makes up this 3D world, and we know that there is this consciousness that is aware of it, that is here inside of it, looking at it, observing it, right? This is all you know. You know you have that, and you know that there's something outside of that. Those are the two basic things that we understand. If you want to go to the very fundamental beginning of what it is we understand, what can we prove, right? What can we reasonably say is the two fundamental things that we know. Now, the next step was, because of something we experience called perspective, we know that this 3D world is a singularity. And the reason we know that is because perspective will allow you to get far enough away from the something to turn it into a point. We see this all the time here on Earth in this 3D world that we live in. We have this perspective, and because of that, the universe is a singularity. Okay? Now, is that singularity a point that exploded, or is it something else? I think it is something else. Basically because we're inside the singularity, right? So, because we're inside of this singularity with this perspective, we know that there is space in between the something. There's something that's not something in between the something, right? This is what's giving us perspective, okay? So, inside of this something, we're on this solar plane that we see, right? And we know that that solar plane is in a galaxy, which is a galactic plane, right? So we're on a solar plane, on a galactic plane, and it is my contention that we are on a universal plane, okay, in the same way. We just can't see it with this level of technology. If we are on a universal plane that is infinite, then what you would really be looking at is a shell of a sphere, where only the shell existed, okay? So essentially we're inside of a shell, right? And that shell is dynamic. It's moving. We know this, okay? We can observe this. Now, outside of this shell is nothing. It's not space. It's nothing. Inside of this shell is the same thing. It's nothing, right? It's nothing to our physical world, because if it were something of our physical world, it would be part of our physical world, and it would not be our border, right? Because the nothing is our border. This is what I'm talking about as a border to the 3D world. Has to be nothing, okay? It can't be this space. Now, this dynamic shell has got is being surrounded by two planar forces of nothing opposing each other, okay? This is what is causing the dynamic nature of our universe, okay? Because what's going on inside of this shell is a result of the planar forces of nothing above it and nothing below it, okay? How are we seeing what we're seeing? How are these two planar forces causing space to be inside of this something? Okay, so you're injecting this space is being injected inside of this nothing. Okay, because we see this appearance of expanding, right? But it's always been my contention that we're not expanding into the outer regions of this shell that I explained to you with the borders of nothing outside of it and inside of it. We're expanding inward on the nothing that's inside of the shell, because there's nothing outside of the shell. The inside of the shell is nothing as well. But because we are surrounding the nothing inside of us, we know that it exists. That even though it is a nothing, it is something, because we contain it. What contains us, we cannot verify. It has to be a nothing. Okay, we can't even verify it as a nothing that is a something, because it borders us, it contains us. We can't be outside of it to see what it is. But we surround the something inside of us. So it exists. So that's what we're going into. And it's giving the appearance of expansion. Okay. Now, how is this dynamic nature turning our universe into galaxies with solar systems in them, and this model of containment, right? Well, nothing that is outside of this shell, right? Because theoretically, if we go back to the beginning, we can see that, or we can theoretically say, and this may have never been the case, but we can theoretically say that in the beginning, the shell was a solid something, right? It was in a way like the singularity that's commonly talked about being the beginning, the genesis of our universe, right? Prior to the Big Bang. I would see that singularity as a shell, okay, instead of a solid singularity, right? I see it as a shell. Now, the shell was as solid as that singularity is, but only in shell form, right? So, where modern day thinking of the Big Bang Theory would say that this solid singularity exploded into space, my theory would say that the nothing inside of the singularity was expanded inward to gain that space in between the something that the explosion gives you. You see what I'm saying? I'm kind of saying it's an inward explosion, maybe. It could be seen as that if you were to look at that time scale, like as a Big Bang, it would be like an inward explosion, an inward expansion, right? The space came from inside, not outside, because we can't prove that what's outside of the universe is space. We can only prove that what is inside of it is. So what's happening is there is space coming from the inside of the something and coming in between the somethings. This is how what I call the division. Okay, this is the division, because that solid is dividing. Okay, it's dividing from something into something with nothing in between it, right? The one is becoming two, the two is becoming four, right? When you divide something, the numbers, like a cell, the numbers just increase, infinitely fast, right? So that's kind of what's going on with the shell. It's kind of dividing, it's cracking, it's got space is getting in between all of the something. And that's why we have the universe that we see, where galaxies are, that shell first divides into galaxies, and inside those galaxies, though, they're dividing into stars. That the galaxies being broken up into stars, and the stars are being broken up into planets, right? And it works its way down like that, as that layer of something is pushing inward. And it pushes inward in a vortex, okay? Because that's the only way you can add plane, or you can add depth to a plane. This is how you add depth to a plane. Everything that I do is pointed towards, one of the main claims that I make is our existence is basically just adding depth to a plane. That's what we're doing. This is life. This is the life of the universe. This is what we're doing. This is what's happening. The universal plane is being invaded by this consciousness. This consciousness is coming from those two opposing forces, from inside the nothing and outside the nothing shell, okay? Those inside and outside forces, by the way, is the magnetism that we see in our world, okay? This is where that magnetism comes from. All the forces on this plane is the magnetism that we feel, that we feel, okay? Now, that's why I think that we have an electrical universe, right? I've seen there's a theory out there that the universe is electric. Absolutely, it is electric. We are electricity. That's what we are, okay? We are electricity. We are the conductive material in between the magnetic flux. That's what we are. That's what everything we see is. It's electricity. All of the dynamics of this universe can be can be called electricity, electron flow. That's what we are. Okay. How is this division actually causing what we see, right? Because this can be explained, and not only can it be explained, but when you look at how these planar forces are creating these cycles that we're seeing in our solar system that I've pointed to in the past, it explains a lot about human history. It starts really explaining why we don't know what we are. I mean, there's just things on this planet that we have found and have discovered that just demolish our thinking of what we are. And there are reasons for that. And, maybe things just aren't what we think they are. And maybe all that doesn't even matter. We don't know, what an understanding of what we are would lead to, philosophically, right? But if you look at the past, you'll look at a lot of things that are very strange, but this theory actually kind of cleans that up, or I think it can be used or utilized to do that. If you believe this, you can say, oh, now you know why the Greeks said what they said. Oh, now you know why the Mayans said what they said. Things that other cultures have said in the distant past, and the things that have been dug up, and the things that we see. These are truly just unexplainable things. The explanations given to them are just not sufficient. I think that if we really understood the cycle of our solar system, we would understand why we find the things that we find, why we discover what we discover that we simply can't understand. And the reason is because our solar system is going through this cycle that there's a burning sun at the center of it, okay? But the planets on the outside of it, first of all, the rock planets on the outside of our burning sun are moons to that sun. You have to look at it that way because that's the way it really is. That's the way that is the makeup of our solar system. I mean, if you look, there are 4 gas giants and the sun in our solar system, and the sun has a bunch of rocks around it, and all of those gas giants have rocks around them of some form or another, or ice or something. You know what I mean? There's something a more solid circle in those that can be called what we would typically refer to as a rock in our solar idea of things, right? And then the other planets are gas giants. They're gases, and they're the similar gases to what's in the sun, and can be seen as types, non-burning suns, really. So what's happening is where you see the sun, it's actually a vortex digging down into that nothing that I was telling you about, okay? And the vortex is getting the nothing, right? As a result, they're pulling nothing in and injecting it into the something with this vortex, right? Space is being added to the universal plane, right? The inside nothing is being added to the universal plane, and it's being forced in dynamically by this planar force. That's why, I mean, think about what a storm is. It's the same thing. A hurricane that you see, they're really the same thing, okay? There's really a planar force going on in a storm. That's what's creating this vortex, because you have the high pressure above everything, and you have the ground, and those are opposing forces. Those are planar forces causing the dynamic nature of storms, right? I mean, it could be due to heat, whatever it's due to. You still break them down to planar forces, right? I like to look at it like a bathtub, right? And if you could just do a cutaway of a bathtub and look at it and take the drain and move it into the center of the bathtub just for a second, okay? And then do a cutaway of it. And imagine there's a vortex coming down into that bathtub. And so if you do a cutaway section of it, what you're looking at is you're looking at the water, okay, having a planar force applied to it with the gravity forcing it down and the resistance of the bathtub pushing it back up, right? That's a planar force. And that planar force is causing the nothing of the air, right, to take the place of the something, right? But you could imagine the borders being the same and the level of the something going down inward and the going down and the nothing is taking its place, and you could imagine the same border being there, right? And the air is taking the place of the water of the bathtub, right? So you have the air taking the place of the water in the bathtub. It stays planar and it stays uniform and because this vortex is sucking it down. But if you could imagine, the water would be turning into a mist instead of going down the drain, right? So you have these planar forces and the nothing taking the place of the something. Okay, now there is a vortex, the drain, right? And that's where the nothing is essentially being let in. Okay, now in order to see our solar system and how it's working, you take this entire cutaway and flip it around 180 degrees because the nothing is coming from inside, right? So, and we want to keep this model the same. So you've got this nothing coming from the inside. Okay, so now we go to what we see as the sun. Now the sun is this vortex that's coming from the planar forces of the nothing against the something is ripping the shell. Okay, it's ripping the shell because the shell has surface tension, right? So essentially it can be seen as a liquid, right? We see everything as a solid, but really we also see it as a liquid because it's like a dynamic fluid, right? So as this shell is pulled inward, where that surface tension breaks is literally a tear between two dimensions, right? The sun is essentially the gateway to an inner or outer dimension, right? This is where it's going down. This is light in our universe. When God said, "Let there be light," this is what happened. The surface tension was broken. Light was made, okay? Because it's the light of stars that creates the light of galaxies, right? So when this is happening, it's causing the spinning that we see, first of all, right? So this is why everything is spinning, because when this vortex breaks this surface tension, it starts the spinning and gets nothing injected into the something, okay? Because we see this sun and these gas giants, why wouldn't we consider that the fate of our sun is that of a gas giant? If you look at the distance of the gas giants, you can see a pattern. You can see a pulse, right? If we see a pulse, then we must be in the middle of a pulse. The pulse didn't stop for us, okay? I think it's very reasonable to assume that there's a cycle where that burning sun is turning into a gas giant, which means it is cooling and will be replaced by another sun as that tear continues inward. Okay, so this tear is continuing inward and leaving gas giants in its wake. It's a vortex, right? And as it's splitting, it's leaving gas giants in its wake. That's the pattern. That's the cycle. Okay. So there is a sun essentially inside of our sun that we can't see because it's really inside another dimension. I know people I think we need to go into dimensions here for a second. People always talk about interdimensional stuff, and I think for me it's very much consistent with the idea I've been proposing, that it's just a system of containments. Okay, it's all about containment. If you think about the first dimension, it's a point. If you think about the second dimension, it's a plane that contains the point. Okay, the point is on the plane. The third dimension is where the plane gets depth, right? The plane is contained inside of the cube, right? The plane becomes the cube. As depth is added, that dimension is added, that z-axis is added, okay? And 2 becomes 3. What contains the 3D? Well, it's the 4D, okay? It's what is the border of the 3D, which is our perspective. So this perspective that surrounds the 3D is time. That's what time is, because you can't really measure space without time or time without space. It's impossible to verify one without the other. That's why time is the fourth dimension. It's a perspective. It's not the passage necessarily of something. We see it as the resistance to that expansion, because if we're experiencing it, it can't be happening infinitely fast. So there must be resistance to this adding depth to the plane, and that's what we are. Okay, and that's what time is. It's that resistance. Okay, so the fifth dimension is the polarity containing it all. Remember that diagram I showed you of the outer nothing and the inner nothing? That's the fifth dimension. Okay, we don't know what the fifth dimension is. It is nothing to us. It might be something to the universe, but it is nothing to us, because it is the opposite of our physical world and time as we know it, and perspective. It is the opposite of that. Okay, we don't know what it is. That's the polarity. That's the fifth dimension. Okay, the fifth dimension polarity of our solar system is contained inside of this galaxy, right? We know that. We've just seen this through telescopes, and we know, how this universe works, that there are galaxies, and inside those galaxies are stars, right? So we know that our solar plane and that fifth dimensional polarity of nothingness is contained inside of a galaxy. That's the sixth dimension of containment. The seventh dimension of containment is the space in between the galaxies. It's the polarity that's holding the galaxies together in this shell. That layer of polarity is the seventh dimension. And the eighth dimension is just the point. It's the perspective outside of that, which allows you to see the universe as a point, which puts you back to the first dimension of a point that we started with, right? This is the octave of dimensions in our visible universe. This is the way I've explained it in the past. Now, that's why we hear music the way we do, right? It's because music is in octaves. Our physical world is in octaves that we observe, that we see and hear. It makes perfect sense. And think about the fourth and fifth dimensions, the perfect fourth and the perfect fifth, how special they are inside this octave. And think about your consciousness, your awareness being inside of this fourth dimension, right? So you are fifth dimensional awareness, even though you don't know it while you're inside of this four-dimensional world. You're a fifth dimensional awareness inside this four-dimensional world. That's why I see our existence so close to that of music in every way, right? That's why we love music. That's why it moves us. Oh my God, that's why it just can't suffer. Some of us, music can send us into a euphoria. This is what music does for some of us. And that's why, because that's what we are. We are this consciousness. We are this electricity from the polarity buzzing through this physical world. Motion of electrons. That's what we are. This is the electricity that I think creates this electrical universe